It's this idea that the Stoic is safe and finds safe harbor by retreating to an inner citadel. I think an idea probably Pierre Hadot might have planted, isn't the only notion of Stoicism. So I wanted to think about resilience as having social supports. So it's, ancient lessons for modern resilience. And I don't think we're resilient by turning to our inner resources only. We're agile when we get supported from systems that are larger than ourselves, family structures, friendships, and that was the fire in my belly.
Hello, my geeslings. This is Mother Goose Robinson Earhart here with the podcast and the introduction to Robinson's podcast, number 99. And this episode is with Nancy Sherman, who is Distinguished University Professor and Professor of Philosophy at Georgetown University. So Nancy has worked quite broadly across value theory and ancient philosophy, writing on such varied topics as military ethics, moral psychology, the emotions, Stoicism, Aristotle, and has also written a number of books on these topics, which are often interrelated in these books. And some of them are After War, Stoic Warriors, and The Fabric of Character. But the occasion for this episode is Nancy's most recent book, Stoic Wisdom, Ancient Lessons for Modern Resilience, which has just come out on paperback, and of course, which you can find linked in the description. And unlike most other popular interpretations of Stoic philosophy, Nancy comes at it from a philosopher's perspective, and she gets at an often neglected emphasis that Stoic philosophers placed on community and camaraderie for well-being. And beyond this book, though, Nancy and I talk about a number of things. For some context, we start out by discussing Aristotelian ethics and some of the differences between Aristotle's ethics and Stoic ethics. And then we talk about some of the lessons for everyday life that come from Stoic philosophy, along with, well, I don't know if you want to call this everyday lessons, but we get into military ethics, Nancy's mental health experience, how Stoicism might help with people returning from military experience. And you should check out Nancy's website, which is nancysherman.com, and also Nancy's Twitter. And she's on Twitter at Dr. Nancy Sherman. That's DR. And without any further ado now, I hope that you enjoy this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it with Nancy. It seems like at the beginning of your career, your focus was primarily on Aristotle, but then it quickly shifted to the Stoics, their ethics, and then in particular, the relationship between Stoicism and war. Though, of course, I mean, you've written on plenty of other things in the intervening time as well. Mm-hmm. But what was it that immediately gripped you about Stoic philosophy and war that got you to change your focus and that's held your attention since then?
Well, it was quite accidental. I got a phone call in the early 90s, so quite some time ago, 3 decades ago almost. And it was from the United States Naval Academy. And they were in the middle of a cheating scandal. And the cheating scandal involved what was called the EE, electrical engineering course. And they asked me if I could brainstorm with them.
Huh.
One thing led to another, and I ended up staying at the Naval Academy for close to 3 years, helping to set up both their ethics course and a place called the Stockdale's. It came to be known as the Stockdale Center for Leadership, possibly ethics and leadership. So the interest in Stoicism and the interest in the military went hand in hand in the following way. Toward the end of the course, and it was a non-chronological course, we came to the Stoics. And their ship had arrived, you might say. This was their philosophy. And it was their philosophy in part because of a guy named James Bond Stockdale, who was a Vietnam War veteran. And at Stanford, you would probably know about him because he has some reputation, having been given the Enchiridion by one of his professors in the humanities, and he memorized it on the Ticonderoga, USS Ticonderoga, and then he used it for 7.5 years when he was imprisoned as the senior prisoner of war in the Hanoi Hilton, or the North Vietnamese prison camp. That said, given he was a Navy guy and a Naval Academy graduate, but with a larger footprint than just that, they knew about him, and they knew about the Epictetus and the Enchiridion. And Stoicism spoke to them in a way it never spoke to any of my students in the past at Yale or at Georgetown. And most of my students really didn't even know much about Stoicism. But whether these students at the Naval Academy knew about it a lot or a little, it was a philosophy of suck it up and truck on, as they put it, deprivation. And how do we endure deprivation? So I got interested in, as I wrote in Stoic Warriors, sort of which was a response to that experience. And the first time I really dabbled in Stoicism, the way in which Stoicism had blessings and curses. I saw too many of the curses. I have some mental health background. And so I saw that many of them thought about Stoicism as a way of forgetting about emotions, repressing them in some ways, dissociating, enduring war, essentially, by trying to tough it up. And I thought that was really problematic. So I came to look at Stoicism, you might say, in a critical way, but also in a very way that made sense to me. I really didn't want people turning to a philosophy that gave them temporary armor, but then handicapped them for life.
Well, you've said a lot of things that I have immediate questions about. One, I saw your mental health background and would really like to get into that a little more later. But the first thing that jumps out at me about your story is, why did the Naval Academy reach out to you? Because I just get the sense, and this is entirely unsubstantiated by any experience, that the Navy isn't often in the business of consulting with philosophers, especially, I mean, for cheating scandals in electrical, I think it was electrical engineering.
Good question. Well, I know nothing about electrical engineering and continue to know nothing about electrical engineering. But I do know that if you ever walk on a campus, such as West Point or the Naval Academy or Air Force Academy and Coast Guard Academy, all places where I have been, it's posted with mottos of sorts. At the Naval Academy: honor, courage, and commitment. So honor codes, which we have at Georgetown, are important parts of the life of midshipmen. And so cheating, is obviously highly problematic. Secondly, I live outside Washington. Annapolis is 45 minutes outside Washington. And so I was within a stone's throw in a certain way. So, it was convenient. And it was actually a chaplain who first reached out to me, who somehow knew of me through my teaching at Yale. He had also been at Yale, but we may have overlapped. So, all these places, and I began with the Air Force, teach ethics. That is, it's a rather important part. Whether it's how seriously it's taken is another story. And in my case, I had these fabulously interesting persons who were my TAs. They were not people like you or like people that I have as TAs at Georgetown or I had at Yale or I was at Harvard. It was officers and sometimes admirals and Marine colonels, and they had been in Vietnam, the more senior ones, like the admiral and the Marine colonels, when I was protesting war. They were in the Mekong Delta when I was on the Washington, D.C. Mall protesting. So I learned as much from them as they learned from me, that's to be sure. Eye-opening. Mm-hmm.
I think a nice way to transition to some of your more academic research is actually a popular piece that you wrote for the New York Times. And the title really resonated with me. And it's, if you're reading Stoicism for life hacks, you're missing the point. And I mean, you have a chapter on Stoicism and life hacks in your new book, Stoic Wisdom, as well. And my first exposure to Stoicism was actually through this sort of cottage industry of books and podcasts, etc., in which you're really just sort of given, I don't know, quotes and unsubstantiated advice. And consequently, I mean, that's what I thought Stoicism really was. It was just sort of an empty doctrine of, I think the phrase you used was suck it up and chug on. But it wasn't until I studied with Katja Vogt at Columbia, who was actually very excited to hear that I was talking to you because she's so interested in Stoicism. But that's when I realized that the Stoic tradition has this tremendously rich history. I mean, that it wasn't just Marcus Aurelius, but there was a philosophy of physics, philosophy of mind, logic, all sorts of things. And maybe talking about your piece would give us some context. What are the life hacks that you have in mind, and what is the point of reading Stoicism?
So a lot of people, as you say, do turn to Stoicism for secular religion, you might say, and secular religion with these very pithy quotes, especially from someone like Epictetus, but also to some degree Marcus Aurelius, although I think he's much more obscure, harder to read, and rambling, to be sure. But
That's
Stoicism,
partially because his texts were a diary, right?
they're to oneself. Exactly.
Yeah.
And they're written on a battlefield at night. I think he had difficulty sleeping. He probably took stuff, we think. And
we can forgive him for rambling then.
That's true. It's not argumentative. It's gratitude here to these people and to those people, and a sense of humility, but also he, like most in that period, would have had tutors who were trained in Stoicism. So it was the street philosophy of the time, and it was highly accessible. And so he would have had familiarity with it. What about it as a life hack? Well, some of it is, unlike reading Aristotle, my true love in many ways, the Stoics have exercises. Seneca talks a lot, who I think is wonderful, talks a lot about pre-rehearsal of evil. So we have these external goods that Aristotle talked about that are part of your flourishing life, but they make you vulnerable to luck. They make you vulnerable to losing what you love, so to love and loss. They're sticky attachments. And so it's sort of useful, the Stoics say, not to think of them as constitutive parts of your happiness, flourishing, or eudaimonia, but really as indifference with a TS, ta adiaphora. And by that, the things that are indifferent. And by that, they mean not that you're indifferent to them, but that you have to learn new approach and avoidance behaviors so that you don't get stuck on them. So they're not acquisitive and sticky attachments or very painful ways of avoiding stuff. And so they have these exercises. You might call them hacks. Life hacks, ways in which you can try to diminish their role in your life. It's not that you give up having friends or having children or loved ones or death. How could you give that up? There's some people in Silicon Valley where you're living, you think you should practice giving up death and trying to be immortal in some way. But, they think, okay, your mortality is something you might be afraid of, a bad. Well, anticipate it. How are you going to approach it? That sort of thing. Or you might anticipate in the pandemic, that you might get quite sick. How do you adjust to some of these things? So they have these, this idea that you shouldn't be blindsided. You should think a little bit. Cicero, rehearsing some of these views, says, anticipate the future, dwell in the future. And so that's quite reasonable advice. And I think that's something that people who are seeking self-help think is reasonable. Epictetus is kind of funny in this regard. He says, essentially, start small and then get big. Small, you might break a vase in your house. You should sort of think a little bit about it in advance, and also cool your jet, if it happens. And then he also says, well, you might go to the pool, and there may be a lot of people that are pickpockets in the public baths, and noisy and gossipy. Something I think about a little bit when I go choose a time to swim. Is it going to be noisy? Will I have the lane, enough of a lane to be able to do the backstroke outside? That's that kind of thing. He's a sort of plan, anticipate. And so that if you do have unwelcome or undesired consequences or outcomes, it doesn't upset you that much. So that's one idea, pre-rehearsing of the bads. And people make a lot of that as a modern day life hack, you might say. Another one is to attach to your intentions mental reservation. Says Seneca, I'll go sailing. I'll go out on a boat unless it rains. Okay, so if it doesn't rain, the beginning actually of Virginia Woolf, To the Lighthouse. Yes, James, we can go to the lighthouse if it doesn't rain. It becomes a mantra in that novel, in part because there's a little boy who really wants to go. But his mother, who I think is Virginia Woolf's mother, Mrs. Ramsay, is trying to calm his expectations so he won't be overly disappointed. So those are some of the practical things that people get excited about, and some, they call life hacks. I can't say that you would really find that kind of pragmatic set of exercises in Aristotle. He's much more interested in telling you what are the constituents of a flourishing life. But it's often called self-help, but self-help is a misnomer, a modern misnomer, insofar as the Stoics were really keen on community. They were the first cosmopolitans. They were not quite the first, the Cynics were, but Zeno wrote a Republic about the cosmos and our citizenship in the cosmos.
Is this Zeno of Kydia?
Yeah. Okay.
There are a lot of Zenos. So
there sure are. There's a Zeno who didn't do so well in a race, or was thinking about races with a tortoise and a hare. Right? Exactly.
Now,
so anyway, that's part of the appeal. But also, if you're thinking about it as self-help, you should listen to Marcus Aurelius, and Zeno, who said, Marcus says it this way: if you've ever seen a body with a trunk separated from hands, legs, and arms, that's what we make of ourselves when we cut ourselves off from each other. And so
that's really nice.
That you really have to belong and have a sense of being at home in the world, a catchphrase for the Stoics, in which you are attached to others or affiliated. They're not turning their back on affiliation.
Now, is this sense of belonging and community then what you're referencing in the title of that Times piece when you write, if you're reading Stoicism for life hacks, you're missing the point?
Yeah, that's in part of it. I really emphasize in my book, Stoic Wisdom, right there, that that people have failed to see how critical and substantive, the social aspect of Stoicism is, in the sense of building a flourishing life through a sense of belonging. And it comes out over and over again. Seneca's writing these letters at the end of his life in an epistolary relationship, probably literary and not actual. But that said, he's always thinking about how he's mentoring someone else, and he can't wait to receive the letters. And if you think of Rubens' very famous painting of Seneca dying, he's surrounded by friends. It's a kind of Phaedo scene, Plato of Socrates dying with his friends around him. He's not doing it alone. He needs help of friends to make sure they get the veins and can help him cut his veins or die in the right way. Mm-hmm.
Well, you've already mentioned Aristotle as your true love, and you said a little bit about his thoughts on ethics in response to that question. But granted that Aristotelian ethics and Stoic ethics, they're not really things that can be summed up in slogans. I mean, thousands of years later, people are still writing copiously about them. But since they are so close chronologically, I mean, Zeno of Citium, who you just mentioned, the founding Stoic, he was born 12 years before Aristotle's death. Is it possible to sum up the primary differences before we turn more particularly to the Stoics, and maybe why Stoicism sort of a response in part to Aristotle's ethics?
It's not clear how much they knew. It was in the air, if not studied.
Okay.
And definitely in the air was Aristotle's idea that's fairly messy, I think, in Nicomachean Ethics 1, sort of 7 through 13 to the end of book 1. But that you need external goods in your life in order to flourish. And those external goods could include some degree of health, wealth, luck, being able to not have the kind of fortune that befell Priam, losing all his sons in the Trojan War, which, if he was happy initially, it would have reversed his happiness. So a major, major blow. Aristotle doesn't quite tell you how you're going to order the primary goods of the good life, which would be your excellences of character and excellence of intellect, and the kinds of goods that are so critical on a view like his to actualize or exercise your excellence. I mean, after all, he's reacting to Plato, and Plato thinks that a well-lived life is possessing virtue. Aristotle says, no, it's not possessing virtue, it's actualizing it, exercising it. So to exercise your virtue or excellences of character, you need resources. If it's going to be liberality, you need some money. If it's magnificence or magnanimity, you need a lot of money. If it's even friendship, which he includes in some way or other as really important in the good life, they can't die early. Your children can't predecease you. So there, or if they do, it's going to create a blow to your happiness. But he doesn't tell you exactly how you order these things, and so it's messy. The Stoics are really keen on bright stripes. And they want a bright stripe between the virtues that they think are, in a Socratic move, within your control, and external goods, which they think are not within your control, preferred and dispreferred. And we're not even going to say you choose them. We're going to give a different term from them. We're going to say you prefer them, or you disprefer them, or you select them, or you disselect. But virtue, you choose. So they really draw lots of rigid lines and classifications to be able to correct some of what they see as the messiness in Aristotle's account. How familiar? I mean, they don't take it on head on, so we don't really know if they how they interacted with it, who was at what lectures or not. But it's definitely in the background. and they then become the three main founders, Zeno, Cleanthes, and Chrysippus, didn't leave us much. The texts are
In
not,
terms of extant
yeah,
text.
extant texts, yeah. So we just presume that someone like Seneca, and someone like Epictetus are reading some of this stuff. We have some of the things from Diogenes Laertius, a biographer, and some where he goes through the lives of, and presumably he was looking at papyri or texts, but we don't know exactly. So it comes to us in bits and pieces in a way that Aristotle's philosophy doesn't. So
Yeah,
uh,
though Aristotle's texts, I mean, come mainly from their fragments of like lectures rather than
good
real
students who
treatises.
are taking notes,
Yeah,
as I
are,
always tell my
are pretty
students.
amazing.
Right.
Now, does this Aristotelian preoccupation with exercising virtue also enter into the contemporary military character or philosophy at all? Because it strikes me as something that if the military or students at the Naval Academy, officers at the Naval Academy are interested in practicing Stoic philosophy, they might also be interested in this notion of exercising their virtue in an Aristotelian sense.
It's harder to read as a practical philosophy. I'm
Okay.
teaching a text course now on Aristotle's ethics in translation, and it's a whole semester. And some of it's very straightforward, you might say, but some of it's a little hard, like, understanding Aristotle's correction of Socrates and Plato on weakness of will, and what's the difference between temperance and continence. I mean, it's somewhat hard to encapsulate. You wouldn't get Ryan Holiday, I don't think, giving
Hmm.
you a popular version of Aristotle. It's I mean, I find him quite accessible, but I've been living with it for a long time. But if you just pick up something or want a daily digest, I don't think the daily digest would be the function argument in book one, chapter seven of the Nicomachean Ethics.
I know that at least among philosophers, we are very content to, and it's just part of our practice to criticize and respond to one another's works. But since you brought up Ryan Holiday, his books, I think, are the most popular about Stoicism. Are you a fan of those books, or do they miss anything important? Are they too simplistic?
I don't know what I want to say about Ryan Holiday. I think his book on courage is interesting. I read it, an advance copy of that, and commented on it. I think he needed to write it. I think he's earnest about his coming to Stoicism. Um, it it was a kind of watershed moment for him, you might say. And his background is in PR, public relations, and it was American Apparel, I think, was the company for which he
Right,
was the PR guy. And there were complications in that, a lot of complications, and
right.
he reveals some of that at the end of um, the Courage book. I think he does a good service in making some of the stuff available. He's a good storyteller. He's a good writer, and he also has minions, lots of people who can gather stories. By that I mean, they can say. I think Florence Nightingale makes a big appearance in that book, if I'm not mistaken, in the Courage book. And you've got to get people who are doing some of the unearthing for you, or to be able to get how that might work and how that might figure. So he's using it. He has a very big platform
Hmm.
and a wide audience, and he's figured out how to popularize it. So, I mean, he does stuff that's rather different from what
Yeah, yeah,
uh,
yeah.
a philosopher would do, who, in a certain way, doesn't have to be well, these days everyone has to do their own PR. Who knows what the profession has become?
Yeah, yeah, sure.
It's not the profession I entered a long time ago.
No, uh, not with all the professionalization, et cetera, et cetera. But returning, I guess, now to the more substantive issues again. Something I wonder about, I don't know the answer to, is whether the Stoics had a fully fleshed out sort of meta ethical stance about just where their ethical teachings stem from. I don't I don't so much wonder whether they had beliefs about moral facts, this sort of thing, but more an epistemic question, like what justifies them in uh, believing the sort of pronouncements that they might make.
It's hard to say. I mean, first of all, they they have epistemic virtues, which I wrote a paper with a long time ago. And so I just want to say that they think a fair bit about cautiousness and credibility and from whom you get testimony and stuff like that. So they're thinking about that. So the kinds of virtues that are generally important in exchange, in and in affiliations and stuff, they spread to thinking about collecting knowledge. With regard to justifications of some of their views, I mean, they have this idea, and it's not justified. It's more just a dogmatic belief that there is a unified cosmos that includes humans and gods, notably Zeus, who often stands in for divine reason.
Oh, so they had a sort of a realist religious perspective.
Yeah, and that
Okay.
and that becomes it gets translated into uh, virtuous actions are in agreement. What is in agreement short for? In agreement with nature. What is in agreement with nature short for? In agreement with the laws of nature. What is that short for? In agreement with the laws of cosmic nature, that is somewhat, that's divinely ordained in some way. And so, in many ways, Kant picks up on this. He has this idea that when you're acting morally, you're acting in accord with the law of nature. That's the formula of the law of nature, is one of his formulas in the categorical imperative. So they think that there are, they're precursors to natural law theory. Do they spell it out in any way? No. They think, by and large, for example, there are preferred and dispreferred goods. What's a preferred good? By and large, the type called health as opposed to disease. But is it sometimes the case that, as we would put it, that a token instance of disease is preferred? Yeah. Maybe if you're going to be someone, Nero says you're going to die tomorrow for suicide, maybe it's good to get sick in advance and die naturally. I'm, an example that's not in the text, but that kind of idea. So they somehow think that this, what they borrow from or get from Socrates in some way, that that a good person can't be harmed because the good person's virtue is in their control. All the selections, wise selections, they think you kind of get guidance by because they're in accord with nature. Now, how you know they're in accord with nature, that's not at all worked out. And they give you lots of examples. Some things have no selection value. How many, whether you should have a scraper is something that you would take dirt off your body with before you go in a wrestling match. Is to have it or not have it, not so good. How many hairs on your head doesn't really matter that much, that sort of thing.
So returning again to Stoicism and war. Now, you mentioned that Marcus Aurelius's writings came like when he was on the battlefield, maybe couldn't sleep, he was writing. Now, has Stoic philosophy been employed by warriors and soldiers sort of continually since then? Or was your work a revival in a way?
Good question. Um, it was something of a revival, picking up on the fact that Stockdale had written this book. What's it called? Sort of philosophical reflections of an aviator or something like that, And so, as I said, he had been an influence at the Naval Academy and had taught in at the Naval War. I think it was the Naval War College previously, and even maybe Virginia Military VMI Institute. I'm not sure about that, but at any rate, he had translated his experience in Vietnam into some writings. Yeah, and he became a kind of his work was known within the military community. Were philosophers really taking it seriously or thinking that much about it? I don't think so until I wrote Stoic Warriors. And that really was in part because I wanted to protect a lot of people that I worked with and who were so fascinated by this idea of Stoicism with a little s, that this wasn't real Stoicism, that Stoicism has really prescient views and important views about emotions. It's not just about sitting on them, but it's about ways you can manage them, a kind of cognitive behavioral therapy of sorts. And they also had really important views about the place. I mean, Seneca, if you look at it really carefully, he doesn't say you can't grieve, you can't cry, you can't shed tears. Those are all overstatements. So I wanted to set the record straight, you might say, and put out there both a plausible as well as healthy view of Stoicism, if we were going to go forward and think of Stoicism as a natural fit for the military. That said, of late, I have been told, not personally, that James Mattis, who was Secretary of Defense and top Marine, puts in his haversack Marcus Aurelius when he goes downrange. So, a tattered copy. So it's
That's poetic.
It's carried by, and I've heard others, some of my students have told me they carry Marcus Aurelius in their backpack and give it to some of their subordinates. So, and Naval, I know a fair bit about philosophy at West Point and the Naval Academy. And
About how it's taught, you mean?
Yeah, because a lot of my students end up being teachers there and on faculty there. And I go and give talks there, and it's pretty sophisticated. Just War Theory is extremely sophisticated. Michael Walzer has taught there. They've been teaching Michael Walzer almost since the book came out, Just and Unjust Wars. So
when I think about all the ways in which Stoicism might be applied to war, it's hard to, even enumerate all of them. There are just so many. But since you mentioned belonging, one thing that comes to mind is the fraternal, and maybe this is redundant, fraternal brotherhood among soldiers in combat. Now, does Stoicism have anything to say about this sort of relationship in particular? I mean, that image you described of somebody, a torso separated from its legs, separated from its arms and hands, this sort of thing. I can see that being a very powerful image on the battlefield, conveyed to one's subordinates.
Yeah. Another image that Marcus gives, if you teeth have to work together, upper and lower jaw. We have to be in sync is one of his phrases, and you can kind of see that. I don't know if specifically the Stoics talk a fair bit about the idea of belonging, or a brotherhood of arms, a cadre. I have written a bit about Stoic social grit in the sense of you know cover each other's back, bring home your troops, never leave a fallen comrade behind. Those are ingrained in military persons, and I think what happens, again, this is tangentially related to Stoicism, is that there's a lot of suffering of moral injury due to war. And by moral injury, I mean the moral anguish that comes from moral conflicts, where or moral transgressions where you could perpetrate them knowingly or unknowingly, where you could witness them, or where you're the victim of them. And that's somewhat different from post-traumatic stress. Post-traumatic stress is a diagnosis that came out in 1980 in the DSM Diagnostic and Statistic Manual. And it was really to do both with war and rape, as it happened in Boston, noted by a researcher.
In Boston, did you say?
Boston lying in hospital, Brigham and Women's, noted by a remarkably good psychologist at the time, Judy Herman. And there was this confluence of Vietnam veterans coming home and rape victims feeling like that they both were the agents of wrongdoing and also the victims. And so the idea of that's post-traumatic stress, but post-traumatic stress by and large came to be signally, because of the time, 1980s, a fear response. You are responding to stress. You're responding to life threat, and you can't control it. And it's adaptive initially, but then it gets maladaptive as it persists. Moral injury, which is on the talked a lot about in war circles in the VA and Veterans Administration and the like, has to do with, as I said, the sense in which your moral identity is shattered, either because of what you've done as an actor, what you've suffered as a victim, or what you've seen as an up-close bystander. And all the emotions that come with that, shame, guilt, resentment, betrayal, distrust, are brought to bear. And this happens in war. You can't bring your buddy home. You survive, someone else doesn't survive. You're standing a foot away, he gets blown up by a grenade, you don't. You knock down the door where you definitely hear armor or bullets on the other side, and you kill a kid who, might be put as a bit of a decoy on the other side of the door. And I mean, checkpoints. You tell people to stop. It's the third, fourth warning, and then you shoot, or you give someone an order to shoot, and you end up killing someone on the way to a hospital with a family in the car. Those, I'd say, are places where you want to know, what does Stoicism say about that? Can you be strong, resilient, have grit in the face of devastating moral injuries of those sorts? Mm-hmm. And the Stoics, don't have a ton to say about that, except I've written in Stoic Wisdom in Seneca's plays. I think there's some remarkable plays. In Hercules Rages is one of them. Trojan Women is another, in which there is discussion about being undone by your own transgressions and feeling suicidal as a result. Heracles, or Hercules, comes back from his 12 labors. His stepmother Juno has one more horrible deed that he has to that she wants him to commit, and she drugs him, a little like Athena sometimes does in Philoctetes. She drugs him, and he ends up killing his whole family. He bursts into this world from Hades, eager to see his family, then goes mad and ends up killing them. And he wants to kill himself. And it's a friend who says, use your heroic courage to stay your hand. And his father says, the deed is not yours, but it was your stepmother's. So those are really powerful examples to me of moral injury. And they're also powerful examples of moral bids for moral repair that are coming from a beloved father and a beloved friend to try to help this horribly devastated, racked with guilt Hercules not commit suicide at that moment.
Something that I wonder, so Stanford and Georgetown versus West Point and the Naval Academy, they're very different educational institutions. I mean, Stanford and Georgetown are research institutions, and the others are military schools. And when I go to a metaphysics class, it's not like it's supposed to, like I'm supposed to get something out of the class that will really teach me how to live. It's there's not really a normative component to the course. Whereas at the military schools, I assume that on some level, all of the education is geared toward training in some way or another. And I wonder if is Stoicism taught, say, in a philosophy course, in an ethics course, so that students are better able to deal with the sorts of hardships that you described. Like I'm thinking, I mean, one thing I just think of, I think you might have mentioned it. You mentioned PTSD. I'm thinking of shell shock in World War I trenches. I mean, granted, you mentioned that Stoicism wasn't sort of taught in this way until relatively recently, but is learning Stoicism or being taught or trained in Stoicism something that could conceivably prevent post-traumatic stress or disorder after an experience like being in the trenches in World War One?
That would be a tall order, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. Um, Certainly, the academies train officers, and you're quite right. But to some degree, so do institutions like Stanford and Georgetown. And I've taught at ROTC programs at Stanford that was linked with Berkeley. And we teach bioethics, and I presume you do as well at Stanford. So it's not as if we totally segregate the life of the mind from the life of practice. Nor in the reverse do they exclude the life of the mind from the life of practice at places like military academies. There are people doing very sophisticated physics and math, some of which will be used as in electrical engineering, for example, or some of it, may be used in astronomy, or people doing these days, I guess, very sophisticated data analysis for cybersecurity and the like. So they are places that cultivate the mind as well as cultivate practice. So just to bust a myth in some ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I didn't want to say it was all one or the other.
Yeah. On the other hand, I don't think philosophy students at Stanford or Georgetown have to go out at 4 or 5 o'clock and sail boats or run around the field a lot as part of their
very little of that here
training. So and lots of people are really get immersed in this stuff. I passed along an article to you that was in the New York Times last week about Ian Fishback. Yeah, I mean, he really, really bright guy, an Arabist.
What did you say?
An Arabist. He studied Arabic, a Mideastern specialist, and goes during his 9/11 happens, and he goes to Iraq and Afghanistan, and he takes very seriously his education at West Point about just war, and also learning Geneva Conventions, and what you can and can't do as a military guy. And that includes not torturing, or many of the kinds of activities that were going on during Abu Ghraib and what he up close witnessed. So, I mean, he's, and many, is living a life of the mind where he has to put it into practice in the field. So,
What you mentioned torture, I was curious. I was going to ask if Stoicism has anything to say about torture. I imagine it could be used as for somebody undergoing torture, but does it say anything about actually
using it.
using it?
At some point, I was looking at doing research on this. The Stoics have lots to say. In particular, Seneca has lots to say about servants. And he's often thought as a humanist, that you should treat your servants well, and that they too share in humanity as you do. But by and large, he's saying that, I think, because you don't want your enslaved people to be fugitives. And if they're fugitives, they could also go to court and complain about how you tortured them or beat them up. And that's always a worry at that period of time. So I wouldn't say practices are that enlightened. I don't know specifics. I can't speak about force feeding, stress positions, sleep deprivation, loud music, the sorts of things we know to have been the case during what was called enhanced interrogation techniques, were waived as okay, and the Geneva Accords were somewhat arcane.
Earlier, you mentioned your work in mental health, and I saw that you have training in psychotherapy. Are you an analyst, or it's just some training there? And I guess has that influenced your work at all with the military or on Stoicism?
So a ways back, I did a research degree in psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic psychotherapy here in Washington. And in part, I was fascinated by issues of development, so childhood development and the like. And also, I've always been interested from the days of my dissertation onward on understanding the emotions. And obviously, emotions play a huge role in ancient philosophy and understanding ancient philosophy. So I ended up doing 6-7 years. I do not see patients, and I've never been trained to see patients, so I'm not a clinician.
Okay.
But it has come to it is intersected with my work with the military, because at various points I got called in to attend hearings, for example, the Pentagon was holding on suicide, the suicide epidemic that we've seen in the military post 9/11, and especially 2009, 2010, 2011. I went to Guantanamo to observe prisoners that were being held, and some of them who were on starvation programs, and we later learned they were force fed as well. And so I've been an advocate for individuals in the military who've needed psychological help, including Ian Fishback, whom I mentioned earlier. And I've often seen my work as overlapping with sort of a broader understanding of moral psychology, where it is somewhat practical. We see students, we're in the middle of a mental health crisis in education. We are often the first line of defense. We see students who are struggling, and I make referrals, or I ask students pretty pretty to the point, pretty up close. Are you okay? So I, you might say I make myself more accessible than some teachers might. And I think I've also worked hand in hand with people in the military who are military psychiatrists who work on moral injury at the VA. I've given talks around the world on issues of moral injury. So I've straddled the worlds, you might say, of philosophy and mental health.
Yeah, and I mean, granted that you're not a clinician, so you're not seeing patients, but still, as someone trained in psychotherapy, do you think that philosophy can or should be a tool for therapists or people seeking therapy, or does
I'm
the
not so sure
relationship go
about
the
that.
other way? Okay.
Yeah, I'm not so sure that philosophy itself is a tool. I think that when we teach courses on the emotions, it's quite useful to understand how the brain works. What a
Mhm.
little bit of neurobiology, what SSRIs are doing, um, um, to be able to pick up depression if you see it in your students or in your class, or issues to do with gender identity that we see in our classes. So I wouldn't say so much philosophy as practical. I would never, I raise a lot of eyebrows about people out there that are coaches, Stoic coaches. There's a lot of that going on.
Yeah.
Um, there's
Well,
a lot of folks who hang up shingles that I don't think should hang up shingles. By a shingle, I'm old school. I mean,
a
um,
degree
a
or a
degree where
certification.
you're in practice.
Yeah.
Um, uh, and I think whether or not licensing procedures are good ones or not, I do think you should be trained and have supervision.
Hmm.
Um, so and there's a lot of stuff that happens on the internet that
Hmm.
I think ought not happen. Is
Yeah, you
quite
can get
quite dangerous.
you can buy a doctorate in metaphysics for $20 online.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
from the
And
Universal Life
yeah,
Course.
7 years at Harvard. What was I doing?
Yeah,
How long you're at Stanford?
yeah. Well, the reason though that I asked that question is, I mean, we were talking about you were talking about moral injury before, and I know
Correct.
that you've written about how soldiers can return from war and lead healthy lives. And I was wondering if Stoicism philosophy was important to that.
I don't really know. I'm never really into um, a fully applied philosophy. Sometimes novels are the right way. I think
Hmm.
people that are coming home and finding it hard to settle in, I mean, should seek therapy. Although it's still stigmatized. I mentioned moral injury. Moral injury for a contemporary group doesn't carry the stigma of PTS or PTSD. And that's, to me, very interesting because PTSD didn't carry the stigma that you previously mentioned of shell shock or war anesthesia, or any of the kinds of ways that we used to speak about war or trauma. And I think that you need to really think that war is devastating. You don't get over it right away. I have students that are journalists who were initially um, in the battlefield and then started covering war for major newspapers. Um, and they're re-exposed to what they saw when they were in uniform, and it brings it back. And so I do think being open to therapy, having really good partners, not living alone, also not self-medicating with either street drugs or alcohol, or
Ice
and
cream in
not,
my case.
what's that?
Ice cream in my case.
Oh, okay. Well, that's, depends if you're diabetic.
Yeah.
um, or having weapons around. All of those things are not healthy ways of treating
Mhm.
oneself.
And that actually brings us to what I'd like to finish with, which is the new book right behind you, Stoic Wisdom, Ancient Lessons.
Mhm.
And so you've written a lot of books. And what then was your goal in writing this one? What was the purpose that drove it now?
I had fire in my belly that
It's a good way to
that
start.
that grew and grew from hearing people talk about Stoicism as life hacks or self help or ways in which we could control our fear, manage anger. And I never heard in these chats I would be in, sometimes on very reputable programs, BBC and other things like that, discussions of the social aspect of Stoicism. And as I read the texts, there was overwhelming evidence that the Stoics took seriously our connection to others, our affiliations, our sense of community, and sense of collaboration. It's not the only theme, but the idea that we retreat to an inner citadel and have control by um, removing ourselves in some ways from the complicated and messy world of here and now just seemed wrong. And in fact, the sage, if you look at folks like Diogenes Laertius, 5th century, I believe Aristotemus, someone who was reporting on earlier Greek writers, they talk about the wise one, the Hasaphas, the wise one called the sage, as someone who is in this world. He's what Aristotle calls a good person, a serious person is Aristotle's phrase, and it's a person who can make money. So is in the world of money making, knows how to get it, where to get it, and how long to hold it. That's pretty concrete. Um, is Could be a general, could be a politician, and could be someone actually very interested in setting up a more, I quote now, a more complete political system. That means someone might actually get angry, not just manage anger, but get angry at injustice and set about to try to change it as a Stoic. So it's this idea that the Stoic is safe and finds safe harbor by retreating to an inner citadel. I think an idea probably got Pierre Hadot might have planted, isn't the only notion of Stoicism. So I wanted to think about resilience as having social supports. So it's, ancient lessons for modern resilience. And I don't think we're resilient by turning to our inner resources only. We're agile when we get supported from systems that are larger than ourselves, family structures, friendships, and that was the fire in my belly, and that's why I ended up writing it.
And so prior to my posing of that question, you were enumerating some ways in which people abuse themselves. So alcohol, drugs, in my case, ice cream. But there's a chapter in your book called Healing Through Self Compassion, Stoic Warriors. And as someone who has very little self compassion, this chapter really jumped out at me. So, what is the general idea here? And do we heal through? I mean, self compassion to me. I mean, it doesn't sound like you're going to respond with by employing like the notion of brotherhood and community. It seems like a very individual thing, having self compassion.
So some of it, in thinking about self-compassion or self-empathy, I was really thinking about the ways in which we are empathic toward each other, and that sometimes we learn self-empathy or self-compassion when we're very hard on ourselves by taking seriously how others view us. They view us with a sense of forgiveness or with a sense of it wasn't your fault. I mentioned Hercules' father earlier, who says the guilt is not yours, but your stepmother's, Juno. She was the one that really committed the crime by putting you in that stupor through which you then used your hand um, in this murderous way. So some of it is the ways in which we take on the perspective of someone else who shows us compassion. In the moral injury repair therapy circles, there's this idea in which you would bring in an empty chair, um, often, say, of a fallen comrade whom you thought you could have saved and should have saved. And it's asked, would that person feel the same kind of um, anger toward you as you feel toward yourself? Are they holding you accountable in the way you hold yourself accountable? So this is in the sense of overwrought self-anger, overwrought guilt, you might say. In some cases it may be apt in the sense that maybe we always could do more. There's always one act or something like that by which we could do something more. And it's healthy in some ways to have an active conscience, but in other cases it's murderous. It's self-murderous. And that's what I was thinking of in terms of self-empathy or self-compassion. Show yourself the kind of compassion that others would show you, and who might even be, in some ways, the victim's the wrong word, but might have been the person whom you felt that you could have done more to help save or treat as a doctor, or the like.
And so the subtitle of the book is Ancient Lessons for Modern Resilience. Is there something distinct about contemporary times that calls for Stoic wisdom? Or a way, I guess, beyond contemporary war, which we've already discussed, in which we need a new or somewhat altered interpretation of Stoicism to best serve us?
Um, well, I was writing this book during the pandemic, and I certainly felt
Lots of
very
isolation.
strongly
Mm,
that we don't know how we're going to come out of this. We do know that we have to work collaboratively, um, and that it's and that in some cases we weren't doing that well. I mean, in this country, it was very hard to share data in the way that in Britain, where it was more centralized, they were able to move along in some of the development of the vaccine in a way that we couldn't. It was well noted at that point. You can follow what we are and aren't doing globally to help address this pandemic and others that are coming up. So, and people were really struggling with loss and horrific loneliness, and deferred plans if people wanted to have children, get married, simply be able to socialize. Or attend classes and, be at Stanford or Georgetown, and not just in your senior year, but for the first 3 years. So all of these were the disruptors, as they say. And I think it was a time in which I felt very acutely that I had to be agile. We all had to be agile with regard to how we live our lives, what we expect of our friends and family as we visit them, if we do visit them, and how we go on teaching, for example. So, yeah, I think resilience was called for and caught my attention.
Well, the last question I have is kind of like a hangers on, but I saw that in your course on Stoic ethics, you have a unit on Stoicism and toxic hypermasculinity. And I was wondering what the relationship is there between the two.
So, while doing research on the book, I came across Donna Zuckerberg's book. This is Zuckerberg's sister, who's a classicist.
Oh.
Yeah. And she may be in your neck of the woods. I think I think did relocate to the West Coast from Princeton. And she wrote an interesting book called Not All Dead White Men, or something to that effect. And I started going down that rabbit hole. And it's not my thing to spend a lot of time on Reddit or other kinds of sites, but I did a little bit following her lead. And it was quite ugly. You probably know this, but Greco-Roman thought is easily appropriated, and it is appropriated in part by in the bro scene, and the bro scene gets pretty ugly. It gets ugly in the sense of bashing women for this or that, for being seductresses and the like, and also thinking that the only people that really can tough it out are guys, and hypermasculine guys. And having taught at military academies and knowing that circle, they worry about it tremendously. I mean, at a recent visit to West Point, that was on their minds, and they use that word, hypermasculinist. And that's guys using it, with worried about the effect of the education on them. And women, also women cadets, women midshipmen, they worry as well. So I lived and breathed in those atmosphere, in those milieus. I knew what it felt like. I knew how it was hurting women. And to see that Greek and Roman thought is being appropriated in these bro channels, and some of them quite horrific, really angered me. So on a positive note to end, Musonius Rufus, wonderful name, and the teacher of Epictetus, said, my lectures are open to all men and women alike, and women were endowed by nature with the same amount of reason that men have. And so they are as capable as men in cultivating excellence of character. So, clearly bro talk doesn't always look at Musonius Rufus. They look at easier digests. But that is what caught my attention.
Okay. Well, Nancy, thanks so much for talking with me, and I'll encourage everyone to read Stoic Wisdom.
Thank you so much, Robinson. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Hold on, Geeslings. Before you go, please like, subscribe, follow if you haven't already. Smash all those buttons. And also, if you haven't followed me on Twitter at Robinson Earhart, or if you're not joining me every morning as I eat my pint of ice cream on Twitch at Robinson Earhart on Robinson Eats, please do so.